This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board.
And I have in front of me a janitor's plastic mop squeezing device that costs about $85. And its problem is that it has two frozen wheels. I think our society should at least be able to repair something like that. I took this out of the garbage can. This should not go to Clinton to be plastically leached for X number of years. That's the end of my rant with that. So let me remove this. So, I've just been reading a rant by Dennis Roberts on electronic signs. You have to think about whether you want signs that are huge, that have lots of continuing different signs. They make much more money than a stationary sign. So they're fairly demanding on your attention. They flip advertisements fairly quickly. So that's something else you have to think about. This weekend there was engineering open house, and there were X number of drivers of buses sitting around, and often the bus was occupied by the driver. So I walked up to the driver and said, you know, it's gotten to be friendly weather, it's not so cold, and you have your bus, which is a diesel bus, which produces more poisons than you can imagine. It's not easy to see them, but they're there. So running a bus engine for 2 hours is questionable. But I like to think that bus drivers might also be interested in engineering open house. So I wonder if the administration that asks for the bus driver, who usually knows the students, to whether they would like to get out of the bus and join the field trip, whether it's a natural history field trip or to an industry or to engineering open house. And he said he hadn't thought of that. He didn't know exactly who to ask to do that. But I think it might be something to do with the administration's responsibility to see that you don't have someone just sitting while they wait for students to go through a field trip. Just a friendly thought. We parted company, and he thanked me for the thought. So it wasn't an unfriendly thing. It's just that as you walk around, think about things that might improve the environment. I kind of think that bus drivers know their students very well, and they know their style, and sometimes they can contribute to the course. We have natural history events, and the bus driver, he knows or she knows that where we're going and what we're doing, they add a comment or two that's rather helpful. There's been quite a bit of discussion about a sole source aquifer it's going through the legislature at the present time. It's been kind of put on hold, I think, because there's a lot of things happening at the legislature, and things haven't sort of settled down yet. But the intent is to make the Mahomet Aquifer sole source of water, and that would be like a river that was regarded as a historic ecological river. So that one's on the go. It's flower and vegetable planting season, so it's nicely warm, and that can be a trick, because next around the corner it might be very cold and frosty. But there are certain plants that do very well in cold weather. The legumes generally, all the pea family does well with in cold weather, and there are different species that are bred to survive in the cold. So you can bring them inside. You can put them in a pallet or a small tray and get them started and transplant them out, or you can put them in the field. Things like kale do well early in the season. The cabbage family, or the cruciferae, does well, and you can get them started. I was going to say something more about that, but I forgot what it was. Okay. Books for Prisoners, there's a sale on April the 11th. Books for Prisoners is a big organization associated with the Independent Media Center, and I pick up cardboard boxes from a comic shop, and we've tried hard to get these boxes returned to the headquarters on backloading, but it doesn't seem to work. But the boxes are double corrugated, and they're really excellent little boxes, so they get used at the Books for Prisoners for people to take a stack of books home. So they do get used again, but it would be better if the organization from the top down would say, we're going to produce a box that can be broken down and returned and used again. CCDC will have its annual dinner on March the 29th, and CCDC is the Champaign County Design and Conservation Foundation, and does a lot of work with natural history and landscape, and is also behind the Kickapoo Trail. It's at a different venue. It is usually at the Urbana Country Club. Right now it's going to be at the I Hotel on First Street. So there are my minor rants for the day. It's a wonderful day out there, and enjoy it. It may not last for long. I went to a rather interesting railroad engineering seminar, and I wanted to report on that. It was a relatively young person, Dan Peltier, who is working for BNSF, Burlington Northern San Francisco, Santa Fe. And he's involved in massive changes in the north, in Dakotas, and where there's coal and oil and agriculture and all the building materials that go with an increase of activity there. There's been a lot of publicity about the lack of vehicles for grain and some competition between grain and oil. And oil also, it's shale oil, so it requires sand to come from places like Starved Rock State Park, where there's an excellent style of sand that's pumped down to break loose the oil. So there's also the trains are rather longer than they have normally been, so many of the railroads are not ready for this, and if it's stick rail, they need to be changed to rolled rail, welded rail. It needs traffic control because the single lines can't take the traffic that's going west to east and also east to west. So sometimes older tracks that are almost obsolete are restored and double tracks are put in. So I was interested in this because in the long run we have to think about railroads locally. What do you do with short lines? Do you have short lines? Do you have fast tracks? How do you switch between tracks? Do we entertain the current technology, which is for intermodal trains? Can an intermodal train that's 100 cars long be broken into 10 different pieces so X amount of the train can be going to something like Kraft Humco? What is it that we want locally in the future? So going back to Dakotas, it's cold, and its growth season is probably only about 4 months, a little longer. The engineering season is about the same. If it's winter, it's cold. You can't get equipment like a bulldozer to lift 2 feet of solid ice. So you have to wait till there's a thaw. Once there's a thaw, everything is very muddy. And before that, then, there's right-of-way. And right-of-way is pretty important because the rights-of-way that railroads acquired in the past are never going to be easy to get in the future. So if you want to put a direct line into a shale oil establishment, you're going to have a real challenge getting the right-of-way and the deeds for the expanded 2-track that you might want to put in. So a lot of the work has to go on early. And around this whole thing is who decides what to do? Part of this is investment. Wall Street is involved. But it's interesting that you don't know always where what resource is. If you have a huge resource for a commodity at one place and it all of a sudden quits, or something more lucrative happens down the road, you can have a whole town that is designed. It's designed quickly so that the workers that come in don't have to sleep in cars. They have houses to sleep in and shops to go to, and that all requires a sort of infrastructure. Then bingo, there's a discovery that's a little more lucrative somewhere else, and that gets to be a planning nightmare. You have a planner sitting in this meeting saying that, yes, that has happened, and it is a financial nightmare because you're guessing. So there's a lot of speculation in this, and you also have to do it in context of people who are not used to moving that quickly. If you're dealing with a road across the railroad line, this has been used by a farmer for years and years, and all the local ordinances say that he has the right to do this work with this little road, which is very seldom used. How can you get people together to think about that and to do it quickly? And if you're challenged by the adjacent owner or whoever, then that has to go through the courts. You also have to know that some of these railroad beds are used by a number of different railroads. So you have to have meetings with people who all have their own agenda. And how do you work it out? Overall, everyone wants to do this thing, but each group has its own agenda. Can we deal with that? Well, yes. But it takes innovative railroaders to be able to come out of that meeting with a decision of who wants to go where. You also have to go through major corridors, and usually they have in the past been narrow and they're bottlenecks. It's like going into Chicago. If you're going from Michigan, Round Lake, Michigan to Chicago, then on to Wisconsin, it used to be that you had to go down into town, and if you have 200 cars, you're going to block the roads, and there's a bottleneck. So if you have 2 tracks going through Minneapolis, then you're not going to be able to buy easements for widening that bottleneck. So you have to figure out ways around it. If you're looking at old hump yards, which is like what we have in Champaign, they're often too short for modern trains. So that raises questions. First of all, you have to modernize the hump yards because the hump yards are still taking mixed trains. That means you take the train up the hill and then let the cars go down into assemblies. That's very different from having a train that is loaded with gantry cranes. So you have to modernize your hump yards. You have to modernize where you store the assembled train because it's getting longer as you put more vehicles onto it. If the train's going to be a little long for where it's going, then you might have to dock off 10 vehicles. Where do you put them? So you have to have backup yards where you can store 10 cars. And then when those trains get on the way, they're very heavily scheduled. And if you have a car, a railroad piece of equipment that has lost its axle or something is wrong with it, the whole train might have to go at 10 miles an hour, whereas that's going to back up 10 or 15 trains behind it. So you have to have little jut-outs that are short sidings that you can drop that car off and keep the traffic moving. These are all things that we have to think about. I've been working at Weldon with a situation where part of our railroad bed, the contiguity, has been invaded, and you have to say to people, you know, at the moment you've got low price for gasoline and you can move grain, but the whole thing of GMOs has not only given you GMOs that are quite controversial, but they increase the yield. So here, there, and everywhere, people are putting up elevators to increase their storage capacity. So you look at an old bed, and nobody that's an adjacent owner along that bed realizes that that bed may come back into action if the price of gas goes up. If you can't get the appropriate transport of grain internationally from canals and railroads, then these railroads are going to be important. Now, that's why the federal government has established a interim trail use with bikeways and walkways and greenways. This is a way of preserving the dignity of railroad beds that couldn't be replaced. So I found that rather interesting. Sometimes you have to also deal with passengers. Amtrak can go on lines that are lighter because they're lightweight traffic. They're not tons of coal or tons of oil or grain. So you have to think about how the traffic goes. You have to think about one-way streets. Railroad lines also have their situations where it's more important to have one-way traffic. Then if you have a construction train going the other direction, it has to waddle its way through this sort of maze of one-way trains. Sometimes if the land is not quite flat, you may have to have pusher engines. So sometimes there's an engine put in the middle of the train and an engine put on the tail of the train. The one on the tail can drop off if necessary, but trains can't move very easily. If there's a rise of 6 inches and you've got 100 cars, that's a challenge. Sometimes you have to be involved in the construction side of things. So this gentleman was involved in construction, and if you're trying to fit a railroad between two other railroads and it's narrow, and you have to get rid of poor ballast and mucky soil, then you have to watch out that you don't have a derailment on the railroads that are active on either side. You have to know your geology. Most of the territory is glacial till, but glacial till comes down from Canada with the glaciers have come across different geological situations. So you may have a glacial till that's a lot of gravel, which is better than if you have a lot of fine-grained glacial till. Farmers have this. Farmers know their soils, and the soil types are often related to glaciation. You have to, if you're going to do things quickly, you're going to have flying flock workers. That means you have to bring in people who can shut a railroad down for 24 hours, and in that process, you have to have a crane which will lift a big section of rail and put it in so that a railroad can come back into action within 24 hours. That means you have to have people who are able to work with the systems. And that means sometimes it's better to have these flying flock people work with in the organization rather than outside it as contractors, because the inside people know the system and they can work quickly. Sometimes if you don't have the ability to put in 2 rails and you want to put in 2 rails, then you can put in sidings that are the length of a train, so trains can pass each other. So non-disruption of the existing traffic is important. And while we're at it, and we're in the business of rail trails, that is a mechanism for keeping the corridors afloat. And David is from Minnesota, so he is used to rail trails between Minnesota's St. Paul and even up to the lakes. There are rail trails that don't look like they're being used, and they may not be used for 50 years, but they're being used by bicycles in the meantime. Yeah, I don't know. Have you traveled any bicycle trails in the...
It's funny, as much time as I've spent in Minnesota, I haven't actually spent a lot of time bicycling up there. It's usually my family are in the cities where you just take buses or people drive everywhere. The last time I was up there weren't even good bike lanes on the city streets in St. Paul. And then I have family out west, closer to the Dakotas than to, say, Lake Michigan or the river and things like that. So I have to say, I can't really tell you a whole lot about how they've been turning former railroads into bike trails up there, because I've never actually gone up there with my bike. What I know about bicycling, it's mainly right around here. This was the first time in quite a while that I actually bicycled to do the show this morning, is because it was such a great day, and tomorrow is going to be even more amazing. And then up in the Chicago area, where they've taken a former railroad that used to go, the Sioux Line, I believe, that used to go through my hometown of Mundelein, and it's now turned into a trail that goes to Lake Michigan. So I'm afraid I can't tell you a whole lot about Minnesota, but I can tell you that there are plenty of other railways out there that have been turned into trails, and I've ridden a couple of them. A while ago, I talked to you about the Katy Trail down in Missouri, where I had a chance to ride just about 15 miles or so.
These are useful places. It's unfortunate when a 200-mile piece of trackage like that is what is called consumed. It goes back to the adjacent farmers. It doesn't go back automatically. They have to buy it back if they've sold it in the first place, but there are various easements and things. But often when a railroad track like that across the north part of Missouri was going out, it was not saved because the Farm Bureau and others felt it should go back to farming. Now, in the long run, you might look at that corridor as a potential rail coming back, and so it's disappointing that it has been taken out. That's why the Federal Rail Banking Act was put forth, was to stop that sort of thing. Going back to the glaciation again, and climate change, many of the areas in the north have been affected by glaciation. So you have a kettle moraine complex where the kettle is a block drainage. But as things change, those kettles have been getting further filled with moisture. And so if you put a railroad around the side of a large kettle or a lake, you may find that the railroad is inundated with water. And that's going to happen more and more as we affect the climate. I'm just looking through my notes to see. I think that kind of... Oh, there's one that's interesting, is that since the railroads don't know what they're going to do and how it will shift, when a bridge is going in, a road bridge, just like the Olympian Drive in Champaign is going to be put in, they're forced to, through their own planning, to have a bridge that will take 3 lines instead of, say, 1 line. They're looking to the future, and it's so costly to put in a bridge that they want a coverage that will cover them in the future if they have to put an extra line in. They also don't like piers, because trains can derail and go into a pier, just like happened at Glover, just east of St. Joe. A train hit a pier, and part of the bridge fell down 4 feet, so that the road traffic coming over the bridge fell into that 4 feet gap. So no piers. That means a structure that is a long I-beam and an expensive bridge to put in. And that discussion has gone on in our location here. Should the Olympian Drive bridges be further north so that they wouldn't have to go over so many railroads or potential railroads? And yeah. So I also listened to another YMCA seminar, which was a guy named Craig Cox, who was discussing climate change, and he wanted to say that water is a food. Some of the concern of the YMCA has been sustainability, and so this was a gentleman who was talking to sustainable agriculture, and he was pointing out that one of the foods that we're most concerned about is water. And you see that happening locally with the aquifer that runs through Champaign to Clinton and Beardstown. There's a lot of concern about whether we pollute it with water from a coal mine, or pollute it from just in untoward action, people putting plastic into the landfill. So we're talking about sustainability and water, and we're talking about farmers who use a lot of water. If you see some of the wells that are on the Ogallala aquifer in Nebraska, you see perhaps 5 or 6 huge V8 motors going all night, pumping water out of the aquifer to the point where the aquifer is almost dead. Lots of water. It produces lots of corn, and soybeans, and it sometimes can encourage, especially in the South, 2 crops per year. All that nutriment goes out with the grains of corn or the soybeans, so we have to then put fertilizer in. And when you put fertilizer in, it's not quite as natural as with an ecosystem that's 10,000 years old. It runs off, and then that runoff goes into the river and goes down to the Gulf, and you have a dead zone in the Gulf. So can you purify that water? Well, yes, there's a lot of toxins in it. We don't know how to remove the biochemicals that are being used for herbicide or insecticide or what have you. We might mean we're dealing with breeding. It breeds for different things, but then we don't know quite where the breeding ends up in 10 years' time. So this gentleman was talking about this in terms of disinfectant, in terms of ecosystem health, and then you have to consider the wealth that comes with the agriculture. He had 2 big points to make, and one was that the U.S. Farm Bill is doesn't really sort out on sustainability. It helps out things like food stamps sometimes, but that's a minor issue. Farm subsidies for corn, soybeans, cotton, rice, wheat. There's huge amounts of subsidies in this, and that drives the agriculture to take up any green space that you have. So in the last few years, it's 81% of these 5 commodities get subsidies of some description. And then if you don't get subsidies, you have crop insurance, and that can be a form of subsidy. So reform is not very effective. So this is something that you have to look at nationally. Whose money is going where, and who's taking the risk? It's often the taxpayers. So there's that whole Farm Bill thing he feels should be remodeled so that it's designed to support the environment more than it's supporting it now, and not so much towards green economic income. The second thing that he figured was conservation practices should be established. He feels that there are people out there doing things. They have little forests of their own. They do organic agriculture. They working with low-till or no-till, and that's rather helpful, but it's so minor that you almost need something that's larger. He compared this sort of reform with the use of tobacco. The tobacco companies have spent many years denying that they were doing what they were doing, and so you have the same sort of thing with agriculture, and so you do get the wee folk, little folk doing things, but it's barely enough. This is a state and national concern, and there should be federal spending in a slightly different way. We shouldn't be turning over all our grassland to another few acres of corn and beans, and that's exactly what has been happening to us at Weldon. In other words, he feels that the voluntary action is not enough. It needs a massive change. He feels that there should be farming standard and practices. There should be a mandatory list of target issues. Mandatory, the word mandatory means that it's something that's a law that is instigated from on high. If you have railroad bridges and they're likely to cause liability and someone will jump off them, then there's a mandate that that bridge should be removed to prevent the liability situation. Well, he's suggesting mandatory target issues that like gullies should be preserved, or so the soil erosion should be concerned. Streams should be managed, and there should be certain laws about them. he was also felt that not only should there be mandated standard practices, but people who violate the practices should be checked up on. For instance, if there's a pollution and it's going through chickens or other things, you should get fined for that situation. And that is happening slowly. McDonald's is changing its style of food, especially in Europe, where the lack of GMOs are questioned. The people are eating less beef. Walmart is changing things, and there's a real feeling that something can be achieved. There were questions to this seminar, and one of them was, could you subsidize certain crops, like could you subsidize vegetables? Vegetables are sometimes coming to us from other countries. If I get strawberries at the moment, they're coming from Brazil. Could certain crops be encouraged so that they would have a local base? Yes, that's a possibility. Chemicals. Some people are still using atrazine and chemicals that are very deleterious. So the Europeans have tended to ban some of those very convenient chemicals, but that should be something that perhaps could be established as a mandate that certain chemicals not be used. No-till is very helpful, but it tends to use more chemicals because it's felt that if you no-till, then the bugs and creatures that can live on the turned-in corn stalks or trash need to be got rid of, so it sometimes ups the amount of chemical use. So there's a question about progressive communities. At the moment, you're dealing with people who have gotten out of the family farm situation. You need probably 2,500 acres to have an effective income in agriculture these days. So many of the wee folk, little folk, have sold their properties to major companies that have the efficiency of big equipment and the like. Cotton is a problem, and there were questions about whether we need so much cotton. I would say sometimes that I look at fabric going out to the landfill, and there is a real sense that we could recycle the fabric that we often throw out and let rot. So that has to do with cotton and wool. Wool has some countries like Australia have ridden on the sheep's back, but the fiber that's there is subject to organic breakdown, and its plastic has taken over. But are there ways of working with nature that would allow you to utilize wool cotton in a more sustainable manner. There's questions about tax advantages. At the moment, at the state level, we're doing battle with the fact that people had a tax break on little plots of forest or nature or prairies, and that tax base has been removed, and as a result, people are selling their trees and taking out their forest, and so having a tax advantage might be helpful. The question of EPA was arisen. That's the Environmental Protection Agency. Very controversial, not very well funded, often making rulings that are not appreciated by everyone, and that's a situation that needs to be rectified or sorted out. There's often conflict between EPA rulings and other rulings. There's a chance for reform of some groups like water control groups. The FEMA is remodeling their mapping so that sometimes people who are on a ridge and are not subject to water flooding are found to be on a map where they're put in the flood zone. So there's a need for upgrade of mapping and reports sometimes. So how do you deal with the poverty community? Do we provide food stamps? Does it involve certain states? Does it involve dumping grain on the open market rather than providing it for poverty situations? How do we go about the economics of the commodities that we cherish, the 5 major groups? So where do livestock sit? Can you have a livestock farm that is mixed agriculture rather than a pure specialization for even Aberdeen Angus beef or Herefords? Or it's just so specialized that you lose the fun and the wonder and the practicality of ecosystems that have 1,000 inputs from different directions, and they sort of mold that soil into something that is more than the specialty. And so I had there somewhere, I had a little note that said, station break. And we have been criticized for not making a station break, and it's almost getting to the end of the show. So we should make a station break to say, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign, 90.1 on an FM dial. And we do quite a lot to try and talk about the local environment, but with context of a national environment.
You have it in your notes, but you didn't mention it. I didn't catch it. We're talking about the cupcake people next door. What was at one time a confrontation involving a police officer into a pretty beneficial result.
Yes, they have been collecting their plastic, and it's quite considerable. We're not against plastic in that plastic has helped. Plastic wrapping has often made it possible to preserve vegetables and other commodities in a manner that you could never do before. So it's valuable, but it has to go somewhere when it's finished, and it shouldn't go to the landfill because it leaches, and that's what we're trying to have, a single source aquifer that is for water, pure water. And so as a result of saying, please don't put that plastic into the garbage, but it's garbage. No, it should go somewhere else. So we had a slight difference there. And as a result of the discussion with a very friendly policeman and other people, we now have a plastic being washed and preserved, and that goes to sites where plastic can be preserved. And I get a lot of questions from people who are working in restaurants who are dealing with food that is left over. We don't have a good composting system here. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a composting system. In some cities, most of the leftover food goes to hog farms. You have to be careful about that, because if you do that with cattle and the like, we've had a problem with mad cow disease. You can transmit from a chop that you're eating a disease that will come back and catch you. So if you have a hog farm, you have to have the scrap food reboiled so that you get away from any pathogen that would be there. The other thing is to let it rot. You layer it, you put down your restaurant food remains, then you put some soil, and then you may even add a little fertilizer, and you turn it for several months, and it becomes very healthy soil. You can do the same with your own backyard. You can have a little compost heap. You're not usually supposed to put meat into it because it doesn't rot so easily, and it also rots and attracts creatures, and it smells. So it's the non-meat type of recycling that we're talking about, but you can do that in your backyard and generate a soil that's not unlike the soil that we would get in an original field. I'm wanting to say that for the Y to have people like that to come in and speak is very good. But from a WEFT point of view, that talk is preserved, and it comes across, and it's aired again on Mondays. And so Paul Muth does that, and that's very helpful. And it's part of what WEFT does. And WEFT is an innovative body. Just this Saturday night, we had the mother lode from Charleston, and that was rather wonderful with the old-timer program that's gone on for many, many years. And those three ladies came from Charleston, and we had a friendly discussion about people who are known in that area, and we had an attempt to have a rail trail down there. So we were mentioning Ernie Whitworth, who's a character in the whole business in that community. And that is what WEFT encourages above and beyond what you would get in a normal radio station. So we... okay, this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial, and thanks for listening.
Dave on the board.